It was not with fanfare that humanity reached for the stars, but with quiet resolve. The Great Crusade, the Emperor's bold declaration that mankind would reclaim its lost glory, began not in a grand ceremony, but in the silent halls of the Imperial Palace and the humming forges of Mars. It began with purpose, threaded through decades of preparation, guided by a singular vision. Humanity would stand again, not fractured by superstition, but united under science, reason, and the rule of law. In the final years of Terra's unification, the Emperor's focus shifted beyond the planet's broken surface. He recognized that conquest alone would not define this new age. Conquest without continuity would yield only chaos. So hidden docks were readied in old orbital shipyards, millions of tons of promethium reserves were secured in vaults once reserved for the Thunder Warriors, and countless drafts of logistical blueprints were composed beneath vaulted chambers of the Administratum. All this happened before Terra's people even glimpsed the hulls of the Crusade's first warships through the smoky skies. These early vessels were not instruments of galactic war, they were beacons of purpose. The first strike fleet, comprising dawn-glinting escort cruisers and combat cargo transports, cut through Terra's upper atmosphere with silent majesty. Civilians stopped mid-chores, and soldiers paused in their drills, heads tilting skyward as the ships vanished beyond the storms, a signal that the old world had ended and a new destiny had begun. The Emperor did not lead his first fleet in person, not yet. Instead, among that initial armada sailed Horus Lupercal, the first primarch found and already being groomed for greatness. The young war master-to-be was given the command of the fleet's vanguard, a calculated decision that would shape the narrative of the Crusade forever. Horus's presence among the stars was both symbolic and practical. He was the emblem of this new age, the image of unity forged in flame of purpose. Their first destination was Stellaris 9, a lost colony world deep in Terra's magnetic veil, forgotten by time. Upon arrival, they found a ghost world, silent domes, halls stripped of life, systems still online but unused. Data logs told a story of war against alien raiders centuries ago, and human sacrifice that had claimed most of the colonists. Horus's landing force swept through the empty corridors, reclaiming defunct STC nodes and restarting life support generators. Their methods were precise, measured, and compassionate, a model for what the Crusade would be. The following weeks saw supply shuttles land with medical teams and engineers. Seeds were planted in hydroponic vats. Divination priests were offered psychological counseling and reassigned to archive duty. A dormant colony was revived, calmly, rationally, imperially. The Emperor's voice reverberated not in triumph, but in restoration. This was not war, it was salvation. Other systems followed. Each reclamation showed a different face of the untested Imperium. Some worlds welcomed the Emperor's banner as liberation. Others panicked at the approach of master-coded cannons, uncertain if this was salvation or invasion. But even where resistance simmered, the response was not bloodlust, it was order. The imperial bureaucracy imposed curfews, set up tribunals, dispatched relief squads. The Administratum measured everything: population health, resource flow, psychic adaptation, and adapted accordingly. By the time the crusading legions entered the Vindelka system, a lost hive world entombed beneath acid clouds and psychic haze, the Imperium's crest had already gained momentum. Psychic readings showed a planet barely clinging to life. Warp communications logs indicated the hive dialect was devolving into superstition. Horus led a relief expedition across leveled spires and reclaimed the planetary capital, reassembling its reign of terraforming domes, installing neural scanners to assess cultist activity, and recruiting new lore-master colonists to preserve old records. When the reports returned to Terra, The Emperor's empire had expanded beyond the Sol system without a single battle fought. It was an achievement in governance dressed as conquest. It was following these early victories that the forfeited records of Terra's floating fortresses and orbital fragment cults were intercepted. Messages diffused across systems. The Crusade is real. The Emperor returns. The old ways are extinguished. Whether born on fear or hope, the message was simple and unified. It was into this nascent unity that the Emperor finally stepped forward. The Ascension platform, a crystalline dais on the uppermost terrace of the Imperial Palace, had been completed. On a morning that would polish the memory of history, the Emperor appeared among his assembled command, a figure calm and ancient, radiating presence rather than power. He did not speak of war, of conquest, of retribution. He spoke of duty. He spoke of rebuilding lost worlds. He spoke of bringing broken souls back into the light. He spoke, finally, of the primarchs themselves. 30 were scattered across the galaxy, sons of his body, shattered by exile. The Crusade would not simply reclaim worlds, it would bring back its leaders. This was the moment the Great Crusade became. No fanfare, no divine decree, only purpose. The primarchs, once shadows in lost exile, were destined to return, not as mythic warlords, but as progenitors of unity. Their reunion with the Crusade would shape every world they liberated. Their flaws would define every battle they fought, and their names would echo in the anthems and treaties of the Imperium to come. The Crusade begins, and with it, the galaxy would change forever. Before the banners of the Imperium were unfurled across the stars, before legions marched and stars were conquered, there was loss. It is among the most whispered stories in the archives of the Imperium, spoken only in trusted company and forbidden from the catechisms of the ecclesiarchy. The scattering of the primarchs, 20 superhuman sons, born of the Emperor's own genetic perfection, flung across the galaxy by forces unknown, remains one of the greatest tragedies and mysteries in human history. And it began, as most great tragedies do, in silence. The project was the Emperor's most sacred endeavor. In secret gene vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, long before the fires of the Unification Wars cooled, he began his work. Drawing upon ancient technologies recovered from the Dark Age of technology, fragments of forbidden science, mechanicum relics, and raw warp theory, the Emperor set about crafting not merely warriors, but ideals in living form. Each primarch would embody a facet of humanity's strength, not just tacticians but philosophers, not just soldiers but leaders of destiny. They were not meant to rule in place of the Emperor, but to serve as beacons of what mankind could become. 20 gestation pods, 20 lives meticulously engineered, 20 pieces of a vision no one but the Emperor could truly understand. And then they were gone. The tale is so drenched in secrecy that no record of the moment exists outside apocryphal mechanicum data fragments and sealed imperial texts. Some claim it was sabotage, that agents of the ruinous powers infiltrated the vaults. Others argue it was fate, that the warp itself rejected the Emperor's defiance of its laws. What is known is this. One night, without warning, the gestation chambers opened, not physically, but dimensionally. Rents in reality, warp breaches that twisted the laws of physics, swallowed the gene pods. No alarms sounded, no defense systems triggered. Even the Emperor himself was too late. By the time he entered the vault, they were gone, torn from Terra and scattered like embers into the void. Each would fall to a different world, each would be raised in isolation, unaware of their origin, and each would become something other than what the Emperor intended. There is a bitter paradox at the heart of this loss, for although the scattering was a catastrophe, it enabled the Great Crusade. Had the primarchs remained on Terra, shaped only by the Emperor's design, they would have been reflections, Perfect, perhaps, but narrow in perspective. Instead, each was tempered by a different world. Ferrus Manus was forged amid volcanic wastelands. Robout Guilliman grew among philosophers and warlords. Lorgar was raised in temples of blind faith. Conrad Kurz knew only the darkness of Nostramo's lawless streets. Each became a product of circumstance, which is to say they became human in a way no gene code could dictate. When the Emperor found them again, they were not children. They were kings, warlords, saints, monsters. Some accepted their true nature with joy, others with skepticism. One or two, perhaps, with hatred burning in their chests from the moment they learned what they were. The Emperor had sought to create unity. Instead, he had sown divergence. For years after the scattering, the Emperor remained silent about the loss. Few knew what had happened. Even within the highest levels of the imperial hierarchy, the existence of the primarchs was concealed. The Space Marine legions were told only that their genetic lineage derived from the Emperor himself, which, in part, was true. But the gene seed used to create each legion had been derived from the DNA of the missing sons. That is why, long before their rediscovery, the legions already resembled their primarchs. The warriors of the Lunar Wolves exhibited Horus's discipline and calculated fury. The Iron Hands echoed Ferrus Manus's obsession with strength. The Thousand Sons displayed nascent psychic talent and arcane curiosity even before Magnus rejoined them. The Night Lords, even without Conrad Kurz, carried the seed of Terra. The genetic bond persisted across space and time, a connection that would later feel prophetic when father and sons were reunited. But this unity would become a double-edged sword. As the Primarchs were rediscovered during the Crusade, each rejoined a legion that mirrored them, yet had never known them. And the Primarchs, in turn, saw their legions not as blank slates, but as echoes of themselves, twisted, sometimes imperfect, reflections of what they had become. Imagine the burden. To meet thousands of warriors bred from your blood, trained in your name, waiting for you to lead them, all before you understood who you truly were. Some embraced it, others rejected it, and a few bent it to their own desires. This was the cost of the scattering. Not just separation, but asymmetry. Each Primarch had grown with his own truths, traumas, and philosophies. And though the Emperor hoped to bring them all back into alignment, he underestimated just how much their absence had shaped them. The most haunting question remains unanswered: who or what caused the scattering? Theories persist. Some believe it was the Chaos Gods themselves, a preemptive strike by the powers of the warp, fearing what the Emperor's plan might bring. Others suggest it was the Emperor's own hubris, that the very act of trying to create demigods in a material universe triggered a reflex from the warp, rejecting the intrusion like an immune response. A few darker texts, hidden in forbidden vaults, speak of the shattering as a test. Not a failure, but an intentional sacrifice. That the Emperor allowed the scattering to happen, knowing that his sons needed to suffer, to endure, to become more than tools of his will. These records remain sealed. Perhaps no one knows the truth. Perhaps only the Emperor does. What is certain is this: without the scattering, there would be no crusade as we know it, no reunion of fathers and sons, no stories of triumph, tragedy, and betrayal. It was a wound, but one that bled into legend. These were the lost sons. They would become gods. They would become rebels. They would become the most loved and most hated figures in human history. But at the beginning, they were only children, and they were taken. Before the stars were reclaimed, before the Primarchs returned, there were the legions. The legiones astartes, warriors forged in laboratories, tempered in war, and unleashed to reclaim the shattered remnants of mankind's lost empire. They were not mere soldiers. They were a statement, a declaration of the Emperor's will, written in gene seed and fire. To understand the Great Crusade is to understand the legions, because it was upon their shoulders that the new Imperium was built, not with words, but with war. The Emperor, in his vast foresight, knew that human strength alone could not reclaim the galaxy. The age of strife had scattered billions across forgotten worlds, and worse still, had given rise to rival human empires, Xenos dominions, and warp-touch tyrannies. Diplomacy would falter. Hope alone would fail. So he turned to science, to genetics, to purpose. The Astartes project was the natural evolution of the earlier Thunder Warrior program, an attempt not merely to enhance soldiers, but to craft a stable, sustainable warrior caste. Where the Thunder Warriors were unstable, short-lived, and prone to psychological collapse, the Astartes were methodical, precise, and built for permanence. Each legion was founded upon a unique genetic lineage, drawn from the Emperor's own DNA and tailored to suit different methods of war. 20 legions in total, one for each primarch. Even before the primarchs were rediscovered, the gene seed from their original creation had been preserved, back-engineered from their original code. And so the legions were born. Recruitment began on Terra, where the Emperor's wars of unification had left a plentiful supply of hardy, tested candidates. Young men, usually no older than adolescents, were selected through rigorous trials. Physical endurance, psychological conditioning, and latent psychic resistance were key. But more than that, recruits had to possess a certain spark, a willingness to be reshaped, not just in body but in purpose. The transformation was brutal. Over a dozen surgical and chemical procedures were required: organ implantation, neural rewiring, enhanced musculature, and subdermal armor layering. Among these augmentations were some of the most iconic: the secondary heart, allowing for redundant circulation; the Laraman's organ, clotting wounds almost instantly; the black carapace, a neural interface between the Marine and his armor. Many did not survive the process, but those who did emerged as something more. Not fully human, not truly post-human. They were astartes. Each legion developed its own culture, shaped not by accident, but by intention. The Emperor did not enforce uniformity. He allowed the legions to adapt. Some favored fast assaults, others siege warfare. Some prized honor in combat, others used terror as a weapon. Even without their primarchs, the gene seed began to speak, asserting traits that would echo louder once their true fathers were found. The Eye Legion, the Dark Angels, became masters of secrecy and methodical warfare. The 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists, honed themselves as siege breakers and stoic defenders. The 16th Legion, the Lunar Wolves, earned early fame for lightning warfare and charisma. And the 12th Legion, the Warhounds, grew brutal and direct, favoring total annihilation over diplomacy. These were not contradictions. They were specializations, tactical tools in the Emperor's grand arsenal. But a weapon needs more than an edge. It needs control. The structure of the legions was meticulously organized. Each was commanded by a master of the legion, an officer with strategic authority second only to the Emperor. Beneath them stood chapters, companies, and squads, each scale designed for deployment flexibility. From planetary assault to fleet boarding, the legions could adapt to any battlefield. Their armor, first Mark II Crusade pattern, later Mark III and IV, was more than protection. It was identity. Legion colors, heraldry, and markings were not mere vanity. They were psychology, symbols of fear to the enemy, icons of unity to Imperial citizens, and to the Astartes themselves, they were banners of brotherhood, a constant reminder of who they were and why they fought. The Astartes did not operate alone. Each legion was supported by logistical arms, remembrancers, tech marines, astropaths, logisticians, and fleet commanders. Their fleets, massive void armadas drawn from reclaimed Terran shipyards and Martian forges, were mobile cities of war, able to deploy entire planetary assault groups in hours. And then there was the Imperial army. While the astartes were the spear, the army was the shield. Human soldiers, armored divisions, and mechanized support backed the legions in prolonged campaigns. Their presence reminded the galaxy that the Imperium was not just built by gods of war, but by men. Still, it was the astartes who took the front line, who broke the gates, who planted the banners. In those early years, the legions achieved what had been thought impossible. Entire sectors were brought to compliance. Lost human civilizations, once isolated by warp storms, were rediscovered and reabsorbed. Rogue empires collapsed under coordinated planetary strikes. Even xenospecies that had once reigned unchallenged, like the massive Krav war clans and the cold intellect sloth, were crushed under Astartes' boots. But victory was not only measured in blood, the legions inspired. To isolated worlds, the arrival of space marines was not always a sign of conquest, but of salvation. They brought order, unity, technology, hope. They were walking proof that the nightmare of Old Night had ended. Yet even in these triumphs, shadows remained. Some worlds resisted the imperial truth. Some marines began to question not how they fought, but why. And some legions, those formed in the earliest days, had seen things in the warp-touched corners of the galaxy that troubled even their reinforced minds. But those stories would come later. For now, the Legiones Astartes were the Emperor's will made manifest. They were his word in steel, his justice in flame, his hope in warplate, and as the crusade pushed outward into deeper voids, their names would become myth. But myth is a heavy crown, and the burden of being not just a warrior but a symbol would prove, in time, to be more dangerous than any enemy. They were the legions, and they would save the galaxy, or break it. The galaxy had forgotten humanity. World after world, cut off by warp storms, devoured by isolation, had slid into silence during the Age of Strife. Civilizations that once traded freely with Terra had collapsed inward, strangled by madness, mutation, or Xenos invasion. Some lost their names, others forgot they were even human. When the Great Crusade began, the Emperor did not just march outward, he reached backward through time. Each campaign was an act of reclamation, pulling the shattered fragments of a species into one unbreakable whole. This was not just conquest, this was restoration. The first campaigns of the Crusade were not against aliens or traitors, but against distance. The warp, once made untraversable by violent storms and psychic chaos, had calmed just enough for a path to open. Some claimed it was coincidence, others, fate. But those who stood closest to the Emperor suspected something else, that the storms subsided because he willed it. Whatever the truth, the opening of the warp lanes meant the expedition fleets could finally move. And when they did, they moved fast. The first expeditionary fleet, led by Horus Lupercal and the 16th Legion. The Lunar Wolves was the spear point. Aboard the Gloriana-class battleship Vengeful Spirit, Horus directed the fleet not toward Terra's nearest neighbors, but into the Corward Reach, where ancient human colonies were last heard from 5,000 years before. Their target, Saragusa, a pre-Unity human world once part of the Zenith Accord, a technological federation from the dark age of technology. What they found was chilling. Saragusa had survived, but not as expected. Its people had devolved into rigid castes, ruled by AI-guided theocracies and techno-priesthoods that worshipped the last surviving fragments of STC data. They knew nothing of Terra. Their scriptures spoke of an origin world now lost to fire and void. When the Luna Wolves arrived, the Saragusan planetary governors did not resist. They praised the newcomers as descendants of the creators. Horus, ever the diplomat, allowed their beliefs to persist, briefly. The imperial truth had not yet reached them. Within weeks, Saragusa was brought into compliance. The Mechanicum dispatched envoys to recover the corrupted STC systems. Imperial bureaucrats rewrote the caste system, dissolving the AI guilds and replacing them with human-led technocracies. Education centers were established to reintroduce rationalist thought. Saragusa was no longer a myth-bound satellite. It was now a node of the Imperium, and it was only the beginning. World after world, the expeditionary fleets uncovered the remnants of lost humanity. Some were grateful, some were violent. Others didn't even recognize the Imperium as real, believing the Emperor's name to be a trap, a linguistic virus, or the echo of ancient tyrants. On Giahan's crown, a gas giant orbited by semi-hollow moons, the Imperial fists found a post-human population that had altered themselves with nanite chains and cybernetic logic cores. They no longer used spoken language. Entire parliaments operated on collective binary consensus. When contact was made, they perceived the astartes as malformed mutants and refused integration. The solution was brutal but measured. Compliance by fire was ordered. The nanite cores were purged. The remaining populations were given baseline cognitive retrofitting and reintroduced into the human genome. The cost was high, but the Imperium would not leave any fragment of mankind unclaimed. This was the pattern of the Crusade: explore, contact, assess, and enforce. Compliance, that was the term the Emperor used, not conquest, not subjugation. Compliance. To most citizens of the Imperium, it means integration into the rule of law, the embracing of the imperial truth, and recognition of the Emperor's authority. But the term is deceptive, because compliance was not always peaceful. Some worlds refused, some fought back, with armies, war engines, or weaponized philosophies. The 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons, once brought an entire planet to compliance not with bolters, but with knowledge. They disproved a world's religion line by line, dismantling its mythologies using psychic manipulation and recursive logic bombs. The population converted in days. But on Vakar Minor, compliance took the form of extermination. The population had long ago interbred with Xenos DNA, forming a hybrid species that barely resembled baseline humanity. Their culture was insular but advanced. They refused all communication. The Ultramarines deployed orbital bombardment followed by surgical ground invasion. The war lasted 8 months. No Vicarians survived. This was the duality of the Crusade: mercy when possible, annihilation when necessary. Each compliance brought its own challenges. Each world forced the Imperium to adapt. But with every integration, the map expanded. 1,000 stars were marked imperial. 1,000 more awaited judgment. And as these victories mounted, so did the legend of the Astartes. To the citizens of compliant worlds, the Space Marines became figures of awe, not because they were gods, but because they were undeniably human, and yet so much more. They spoke the Emperor's language. They brought food, order, and medicine. But they also brought silence. The kind that fell after a world's history was rewritten in the name of unity. Yet for all their power, the Astartes were not conquerors in their own minds. They were builders. The Great Crusade was not a war. It was a mission. And behind every bolter round, every orbital bombardment, was a single unshakable belief. Humanity must stand together or die alone. But there were cracks. Even early in the Crusade, murmurs passed between command channels. Some worlds seemed different. Not just advanced or stubborn, but tainted, warp-bled, strange psychic anomalies that resisted analysis. Entire cities where time flowed in reverse, where thoughts echoed before they were spoken, where children aged backward during conversation. The librarius had yet to be fully formalized. Psychers were present but unregulated. Some astartes began to feel uneasy. They called these encounters untruths of the void, things not meant to be, yet undeniably there. The Emperor, it was said, took note, but he gave no orders to halt the crusade. His purpose remained fixed, his vision was clear. The stars would be reclaimed, the warp would be tamed, the lost worlds of mankind would remember their name, and he would unite them, no matter what was found in the shadows between them. As the crusade entered its second decade, a pattern had formed. The Lunar Wolves spearheaded compliance, the Ultramarines established governance, the Iron Hands enforced structure, the Word-Bearers began to preach. But that is a story for another time. For now, the stars were being pulled back into the orbit of the Imperium, one system at a time. And somewhere beyond the edge of known space, a primarch stood atop a foreign world, unaware that his father was coming. The Great Crusade had begun, but its heart was still incomplete. Before there was a war master, there was a son. He stood on the ash-choked plains of Chthoniya beneath a red and broken sky. Cities tunneled deep into the world's crust burned behind him. Violence was a language spoken without pause in the ruins of that ancient planet, and Horus Lupercal had mastered it before he'd spoken his first words. He was the first to be found, the first to kneel, the first to call the Emperor father, and for a time the first to love him without question. Horus had grown to adulthood on the dying world of Chthoniya, a planet so hollowed out by strip mining, civil collapse, and techno-gang warlords that its surface had begun to collapse in on itself. What remained were tunnel networks teeming with violent brotherhoods, subterranean militias, and self-governed kill clans who lived by one rule: strength survives. It was into this crucible that the warp-flung infant Primarch landed, his gestation pod arriving in a burning comet that struck the deepest slum zone of Chthoniya's hive core. He should have died, but he didn't. He grew, and he ruled. Even as a child, Horus dominated the gangs not through brutality, but charisma. He organized rival groups into functioning territories, imposed codes of loyalty, and fostered a strange kind of unity among men who had never known anything but betrayal. The underworld of Chthoniya became his empire in miniature, and by the time he reached maturity, he was already seen by many as a living myth. Taller than any man, fast beyond measure, and always 5 moves ahead. But his legend was about to be dwarfed, because one day from the skies above Chthoniya, a fleet of golden warships broke through the pollution belts. At their head was a vessel unlike any other, the Bucephalus, flagship of the Emperor himself. The Great Crusade had finally reached its first lost son. Their meeting is not recorded in detail. No transcript survives, but echoes of it can be found in private logs, astartes recollections, and fragmentary remembrances. It is said that the Emperor descended alone, that he walked through the upper corridors of Chthoniya's hive spire like he had done it 1,000 times, that the gangs who saw him either fled or fell to their knees without knowing why. And then, at the center of a ruined amphitheater once used for executions, Horus waited. He did not kneel at first. He watched. The two regarded each other, father and son, genetic equals, separated by ambition and accident. No one knows who spoke first. Some say Horus offered a hand. Others claim the Emperor called him by name. Horus, meaning the Rising One, the bringer of dawn. What is known is this: Horus knelt, and from that moment onward he would never truly stand apart from his father again. The Emperor did not leave him behind. Horus was brought aboard the Bucephalus as an equal, not a prize. He toured the vessel, sat in war councils, studied imperial doctrine. He was introduced to the Lunar Wolves, his legion, who had already begun to resemble him in manner and method. Their reunion was smooth, even joyous. The warriors saw in Horus not just their primarch, but a leader they already understood. Under the Emperor's direct guidance, Horus became the standard by which all future reunions would be judged. He was bold but measured, loyal but unafraid to question, a conqueror but never needlessly cruel. With Horus at his side, the pace of the crusade accelerated. The 16th Legion surged through sector after sector, employing lightning strike tactics and coordinated diplomacy that allowed for swift compliances. Horus was not just a warlord, he was a visionary. He understood that fear could win battles, but trust built empires. In one campaign, he brokered a surrender between 3 warring city-states by offering their rulers places in the new imperial hierarchy, under strict oaths of fealty. When a rival governor broke the pact, Horus leveled their capital with orbital bombardment. The survivors never questioned imperial rule again. He made examples, not graveyards. He became a name that inspired awe across the stars. The Emperor trusted Horus in a way he would trust no other. Together, they led joint campaigns. On Lupercalia, a planet later named in his honor, they fought side by side in a siege that lasted 29 days without rest. Stories from that war became legend. Horus tearing through bio-armored Xenos beasts, the Emperor shielding mortals with psychic wards, the two of them laughing amid the flames as they secured yet another system. It was during these campaigns that Horus became something more than a commander. He became a symbol of loyalty, of clarity, of mankind's potential. Other expeditionary fleets began to echo his methods. His tactical doctrines were absorbed into general training. The term Lupercalian strike pattern became standard among battle fleet manuals. And the people, they began to whisper a title, the Emperor's right hand. But such loyalty came with a price. Horus's closeness to the Emperor began to isolate him from the others. At the time, most primarchs were still lost. The few that had been found, like Leman Russ or Ferrus Manus, saw Horus's elevation with mixed feelings. Was he merely the first, or was he the favorite? In the halls of command, Horus sat at the Emperor's right. In strategic conclaves, his words carried more weight. When orders were disputed, it was often Horus who clarified the Emperor's intent. Some resented him for it, others admired him, but all knew he was first. And for Horus, that responsibility was both a blessing and a burden. It is easy, in hindsight, to read shadow into his story, to see every triumph as foreshadowing, to view his love for the Emperor as fragile, destined to crack. But history is not prophecy. In these early years, Horus was unshakably loyal. He called the Emperor father, not out of obedience, but with genuine affection. He mentored his captains personally. He mourned the dead. He studied Xenos culture not out of heresy, but so he could better destroy it. He believed in the vision of the Imperium, and the Emperor, in turn, believed in him. Years later, when the title of War Master would be bestowed, when brother would turn on brother, when Horus's name would become synonymous with treachery, some would look back at these moments in disbelief. How could this happen? He was the best of us. We loved him. The answer lies not in weakness but in strength. Because only those who are trusted, only those who are loved, can truly betray. But not yet. For now, Horus Lupercal marched beneath the eagle of the Imperium with pride in his heart and fire in his hands. He was the first son returned. And for a time it was enough. The Emperor of mankind did not conquer the stars by accident. He did it by design. His war was not just fought with bolters and blade, nor with fleets and gene-forged soldiers. It was fought with principle, with ideology as sharp as any sword, as absolute as any fortress wall. And nowhere is that more clear than in the system he called compliance. Compliance was not simply the act of surrender, it was the reforging of a world, politically, culturally, and spiritually. To be brought into the Imperium was not to bow, but to change, to become something new. A planet might offer no resistance militarily, but if its people still clung to forbidden faiths, mutant castes, Xenos tolerance, or pre-imperial sovereignty, then it was not compliant. Not in the Emperor's eyes. Compliance was all or nothing, and the cost of non-compliance was annihilation. The Emperor's vision was vast, a single human civilization, stretching across the stars, bound by the rule of reason and the supremacy of mankind. The Imperium was not to be a patchwork of ancient customs and superstitions. It was to be a seamless machine, functional and ordered. To this end, the Emperor implemented what would become one of the most enduring and polarizing pillars of the Imperium, the imperial truth. The imperial truth taught that there were no gods, no magic, no demons, no supernatural forces. All phenomena could be explained through science, logic, and natural law. It was a clean, secular doctrine, designed to wipe clean the stains left by the age of strife, an age in which belief had become a weapon and ignorance a plague. It was not enough for humanity to be united in body. The Emperor required unity of mind. To spread this doctrine, the Emperor equipped each expeditionary fleet not only with warriors, but with remembrancers, iterators, administratum clerks, and logothetes, individuals trained to educate, debate, and, when necessary, recondition entire populations. On compliant worlds, schools were established overnight. Libraries were stocked with Imperium-approved texts. Old religions were outlawed. Priests were either re-educated or executed. History was rewritten, not out of malice, but because the old stories, in the Emperor's eyes, were poison. This was not genocide. This was standardization. The Imperium could not be built on fractured memories and broken dreams. It had to begin clean. In some cases, entire cultures were permitted to survive, but only those aspects deemed useful. On the world of Balforax, for example, a pre-imperial caste system was restructured to align with imperial guild organization. Ritual dances were allowed to continue, but only after being reclassified as heritage ceremonies with no spiritual significance. On Nex Sapphics, where the dominant population worshipped a stellar deity that coincidentally aligned with astronomical reality, the Emperor allowed a sanitized version of their belief to persist, so long as it was reframed as poetic metaphor rather than literal truth. Such decisions were pragmatic, not sentimental. The Emperor was not heartless, but he was utterly practical. He also understood when not to show his face. Despite his immense power and psychic majesty, the Emperor rarely appeared on the battlefield. He chose to lead by example through delegation, allowing the primarchs and their legions to become the face of the crusade. His presence was reserved for symbolic moments, to elevate a victory, to cement a pact, or to remind a world of what stood behind the soldiers who walked their soil. To the average citizen, the Emperor was not just a man. He was history incarnate, a distant but omnipresent force, shaping reality from the shadows. But not every world was so easily molded. Some civilizations had grown sophisticated in their isolation. On Catha Omega, a council of philosopher kings resisted compliance not with weapons, but with logic. They welcomed the Imperials, offered hospitality, and engaged in weeks of high-level debates with iterators from the Administratum. Their argument? That the imperial truth was itself a belief system, one that simply displaced others without evidence. The Emperor's reply was simple. Belief is a shackle. Truth does not require worship. Catha Omega refused to yield. 2 months later, the city moons of their system were reduced to carbon glass. The Emperor did not relish such measures, but he did not hesitate, because his method was certainty. Another facet of the Emperor's strategy was infrastructure. As worlds were brought into the fold, they were immediately woven into the Imperium's logistical web. This was not done through bureaucratic chaos, but with deliberate and rapid integration. New governors were appointed from trained Terran officials or carefully chosen locals. Standard planetary time cycles were enforced. Currency was unified. Trade routes were recalibrated. A centralized system of measurement, law, and taxation was imposed. Every compliant world became another gear in the great machine. The goal was not freedom. It was function. And through this, the Emperor ensured that the Imperium would not crumble the moment his gaze turned elsewhere. Yet for all this discipline, the Emperor remained enigmatic. Even his closest sons never fully understood the totality of his plan. Some primarchs questioned why the imperial truth was so inflexible. Others wondered why the Emperor refused to speak more openly of the warp, of the dangers beyond the veil of reality. To them, he offered only cryptic guidance. Some truths, he claimed, could not be spoken until the time was right, and some burdens could only be borne by him alone. There were whispers, even then, of disquiet. Some iterators reported rising resentment among conquered peoples. Others noticed a strange emptiness in the eyes of those who renounced faith under pressure. A few astartes, especially those of more spiritual disposition, struggled to repeat the imperial truth without hesitation. But dissent was not permitted to bloom. Where ideological rot appeared, it was cut out. Where morale flagged, symbols of imperial strength were made visible, monuments were raised, statues of primarchs carved into alien mountains. The Aquila burned bright on every skyline. Compliance was not just the end of war, it was the beginning of order. This was the Emperor's method, a vision sharpened into doctrine. Doctrine enforced through structure, structure executed with total unwavering will. Not because he craved power, but because he had seen the alternative. He had seen what the warp could do, what chaos could wrought, what a divided species could become. And so he built an Imperium, not of compromise, but of control. It was the only way. By the 50th year of the Great Crusade, the Imperium of man was no longer a dream or a declaration. It was a fact. Across the stars, banners bearing the double-headed Aquila hung from fortresses carved into alien moons and city towers that had once been temples to false gods. Warp routes, long thought impassable, were now pulsing with the lifeblood of imperial logistics. The Crusade had grown from a Terran enterprise into a galactic movement, vast, relentless, and breathtaking in scale. But it did not grow through momentum alone. It grew because of the Emperor's sons. With Horus already at his side, the Emperor turned his attention to the remaining lost primarchs. Their rediscoveries began as isolated miracles and soon became turning points. Every primarch brought home meant not just a reunion, but a revolution in how the Crusade unfolded. Each world they were found on had shaped them differently. Each reunion reshaped the Imperium itself. When Leman Russ, the Wolf King, was found on the icy death world of Fenris, he brought with him an instinct for war honed in a realm of monsters and tribal honor. His 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, immediately began to specialize in shock assault and relentless pursuit operations, vital in bringing rogue warlords and non-compliant frontier worlds into line. Then came Pharasmanis of Medusa, whose iron hands forged weapons in the image of their master's obsession with strength. With him, entire subsectors were overrun by siege forces that combined relentless assault with near-mechanical efficiency. His campaigns were not elegant, but they were brutal and left nothing behind but compliance and silence. Each recovered primarch was a catalyst. Each arrival changed the tide of war. The expansion of the Crusade was not just outward, it was inward too. The political machinery of the Imperium evolved in tandem with its front lines. Entire sub-bureaucracies formed under the Adeptus Terra, from planetary governorships to logistics ministries. The Mechanicum of Mars sent out more forge fleets to assist in maintaining and retrofitting the thousands of vessels now required to keep the Crusade operational. Forge worlds bloomed across the stars, imperial shipping lanes webbed through void space. Massive shipyards like Hydra 4 and Lucius became vital strategic hubs. But it was not only human worlds that fell under the Imperium's gaze. The expansion of the Great Crusade meant increasing contact with Xenos civilizations, some ancient, some emergent, and all considered an existential threat to mankind's destiny. The orcs, encountered on dozens of systems, proved to be a near-constant plague, not because they were particularly sophisticated, but because they were everywhere. They infested asteroid belts, industrial husks, even post-human ruins, spreading like rot beneath the floorboards of galactic civilization. The World Eaters, under Angron after his rediscovery, would later take grim pleasure in burning these infestations out by the millions. The Eldar, encountered only rarely during this phase, were already in decline, ghosts of an empire too proud to kneel and too few to resist. Their craft worlds, enormous city ships adrift in the void, were avoided more often than attacked. But when war came, it was swift and tragic. The Luna Wolves led one of the first such engagements, ending in total annihilation for the Eldar colony and heavy losses for the Imperium. The Interrex, a Xenos sympathetic human polity encountered later, would be a turning point. But that is a tale for another chapter. For now, the policy was simple. There shall be no peace with the alien. No diplomacy, no tolerance, no exceptions. And the legions enforced it with fire. At the height of the Crusade's expansion, over 10,000 systems had been brought into imperial compliance. That figure is staggering, but even more astonishing was the rate of integration. Dozens of worlds per month, fleets fanning out in every direction. Dozens of primarchs now reunited with their legions, acting as warlords and governors in equal measure. Some primarchs cooperated, others competed. Rogal Dorn, once found on Inwit, brought precision and architectural mastery to the Imperium. His imperial fists didn't just conquer, they built. Defensive bastions, command posts, and infrastructure that would last millennia. Dorn's influence stretched beyond the battlefield into the very bones of imperial strategy. Robute Gueliman, when finally found on Macrage, transformed the eastern marches of the Crusade. Not content with mere conquest, he authored full civil governance models. With him, the Ultramarines brought not just order but efficiency, a miniature Imperium within the Imperium, functioning even without constant Terran oversight. Not all primarchs were so disciplined. Some strained against the chain of hierarchy, some sought their own truths in the warp-tainted dark. But at this stage of the Crusade, unity still held, just barely. The expansion wasn't without cost. The farther the Imperium reached, the thinner its attention was stretched. Supply lines grew perilous, coordination between fleets became more complex. Some systems, once compliant, began to slip back into rebellion or worse. Mutation. Even among the astartes, attrition became a concern. Gene seed had to be cultivated, harvested, and safeguarded. The apothecarian grew in importance. Veteran squads were rotated back from the front lines to serve as trainers. The legions, once bristling with fresh warriors, had to learn the rhythms of a long war. There was no end in sight. Only more stars, only more campaigns, only more glory. But perhaps the most telling development of this era was not military at all. It was psychological. As the Crusade expanded, so too did the myth of the Imperium. Entire worlds began worshipping the primarchs as demigods, despite the imperial truth. On Kyme, the people referred to Vulcan as the Eternal Flame. On Olympia, Perturabo was named the Stone Sun, though he barely acknowledged the praise. Even Horus, ever careful, was honored in effigies by the populations he saved, statues of the Wolf of Luna carved into entire mountain ranges. The emperor forbade such idolatry, but it spread anyway, and the further the legions marched, the less control the emperor had over what his Imperium believed. Yet none of that seemed to matter. Not yet. The war was being won, the stars were being claimed, and the dream, so long whispered, now burned on banners 1,000 light years wide. This was the golden era of the Great Crusade, before the doubts, before the shadows, before the cracks. The Imperium had never stood taller, and the fall, well, the fall was still far away. They had been scattered by forces beyond comprehension, torn from Terra in infancy, flung across the galaxy by unseen hands, and raised as strangers to their own blood. And yet, despite the odds, one by one they returned. The Emperor's sons, the primarchs. Their rediscovery would not be simple reunions. These were not lost children waiting to be rescued. They were rulers, warlords, and demigods, forged by the worlds they landed on, tempered in isolation and hardened by survival. The Great Crusade would bring them home, but it would never unmake who they had become. The reunions did not follow a pattern. Some came early, others decades later. But each left an indelible mark on the Imperium, changing not only the nature of the Crusade, but the fate of the legions they were destined to lead. Each encounter was unique. Each reunion rewrote the future. On the storm-racked world of Fenris, the 6th Legion came face to face with a myth carved in flesh. Leman Russ had grown amid the ice wolves and the feuding jarls of that brutal world, a child raised not by men but by beasts before rising to rule as king. When the emperor arrived, Russ did not bow. He challenged. Legend tells of their 3 contests: feasting, drinking, and combat. The emperor bested him in all 3, but he did not do so with power alone. He did it with grace, with patience, and with laughter. In that moment, Russ recognized not just a master, but a father. The bond was sealed. The 6th Legion, already known for their wild ferocity, became wolves with a purpose, their bite now tempered by the cunning of their king. On Nocturne, in the deep reaches of the Segmentum Obscurus, Vulcan was found amid volcanic plains and fire-wrought forge clans. He was known to his people as a protector, a blacksmith, a giant who could wrestle drakes and carry wounded children from burning homes. The emperor came to him not with a legion, but with an invitation to rise above myth and reclaim his place in a wider war. Vulcan's response was not pride, it was humility. He joined the Imperium not to conquer, but to safeguard. His 18th Legion, the Salamanders, became more than warriors. They were defenders of the weak, the broken, the forgotten. Their fires burned not with wrath, but with duty. In the arid highlands of Baal, Sanguinius ruled a dying world plagued by radiation and mutation. His wings, angelic and resplendent, had marked him as divine from the moment of his birth, but he had never seen himself that way. When the Emperor arrived, there was no conflict, no challenge. Sanguinius saw him and understood. Their bond was instant, wordless, as if it had never truly been broken. The 9th Legion, the Blood Angels, embraced him with reverence, their own mutated line redeemed by the purity of their primarch. But even then, there was darkness. Sanguinius saw visions, terrible futures hidden in dreams. He spoke little of them, only that his father's path would end in blood and fire. On Olympia, the genius of Perturabo was a double-edged sword. Raised in a city-state of rivalry and betrayal, he had become cold, calculating, obsessed with structure, geometry, and order. When the Emperor came, Perturabo did not question his claim. He questioned his logic. The reunion was respectful, but distant. Perturabo accepted command of the 4th Legion with precision and efficiency, but behind his eyes burned a resentment that would one day grow too large to contain. Resentment that no one had come for him sooner, that his gifts had been squandered in the dust of a fractured world. Still he marched, and the Iron Warriors reshaped entire war zones with brutal architectural might. Then there was Magnus, the one-eyed sorcerer of Prospero, already walking the edge of forbidden knowledge long before he ever saw Terra again. His psychic might was unmatched, even among his brothers. When the Emperor arrived, Magnus welcomed him not as a stranger, but as a long-expected guest. Their bond was intellectual, almost spiritual. The 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons, had long dabbled in arcane lore and warpcraft. Now, with their primarch, their potential exploded. But so too did their isolation, mistrusted by other legions, whispered about in private briefings. Still, Magnus believed. He believed more than most. And that belief would burn him. Not all reunions ended in harmony. On Nuceria, Angron was found in chains, a gladiator forced to fight in the arenas of a tyrant's pleasure dome. His psychic screams echoed across the warp long before the Emperor set foot on the planet. Angron did not want to be saved. He wanted to die with his fellow slaves in rebellion, on his own terms. But the Emperor, ever the strategist, had other plans. He teleported Angron aboard his ship in the final hour, abandoning the rebellion below. The bond was broken before it began. Angron joined the Imperium not out of loyalty, but because he had nowhere else to go. The 12th Legion, the Warhounds, took his name and became World Eaters. Each reunion rewrote the legion it touched. Each primarch shaped the men who bore his gene seed, gave them direction, gave them identity. The sons returned, one by one, and the Imperium grew stronger, but also more complex. Some brothers bonded deeply. Horus and Sanguinius became close, their ideals mirrored in compassion and charisma. Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim formed an alliance of opposites, strength and beauty. Gilliman, ever the statesman, kept ties with many, but others clashed. Kurz despised Dorn's rigidity. Russ mistrusted Magnus's sorcery. Mortarion bristled at the arrogance of more idealistic brothers. These tensions remained hidden beneath the Crusade's victories, for now. At the peak of the Primarch's return, 17 had been found. Only 2 remained lost. Their names have been struck from every record, their legions erased. Their stories, perhaps the most tragic of all, known only to the Emperor. And so the wheel turned. The galaxy watched as the Emperor's lost sons took their place beside him. Some as loyal swords, others as simmering embers, waiting for a spark. But for that moment, that brief, golden moment, they stood united, and the stars burned in honor of their return. Before Terra reclaimed the stars, it first had to look to the red world in its sky. Mars, a planet of fire and metal, of rituals and rust, of secrets so ancient they had become scripture. The Emperor had united Terra with sword and science, but he knew that conquering Earth would never be enough. To raise the Imperium of man from the ashes of old night, he would need machines, engines of war, ships to cross the void, weapons to shatter cities. And for that, he turned to Mars. The Martian Mechanicum had survived the age of strife, not by avoiding conflict, but by embracing fanaticism. As the storms raged and warp tides drowned whole sectors, the priesthood of Mars withdrew into itself, sealing its forged cathedrals and turning inward to ritual, logic, and the worship of the machine god. They did not forget Terra. They remembered it as the origin, the birthplace of humanity and knowledge, but not as the center of their faith. The Martians did not worship the Emperor. They worshipped the Omnissiah, the unknowable machine god who existed not as a man, but as the divine manifestation of perfect function. To them, knowledge was sacred, technology was prayer, innovation was heresy unless sanctioned by ancient designs. The greatest ambition was not invention, but rediscovery. Yet for all their rituals and binary litanies, they had preserved what Terra had lost. Mass production, macro-architecture, cybernetics, void ship manufacturing. In the vaults of Mars, amid the ringing of hammers and the hiss of incantatory steam, the tools of empire had endured, and the Emperor needed them. The Treaty of Mars, signed in the earliest years of the Unification Wars, was not a simple alliance. It was a pact of pragmatism. The Emperor did not attempt to erase the beliefs of the Mechanicum, not yet. Instead, he presented himself as the Omnissiah incarnate, not a rival deity, but the fulfillment of their prophecy, the machine god in the flesh. Logic made manifest. Some within the Martian priesthood rejected this blasphemy. Others embraced it. The Fabricator General, head of the Mechanicum, chose to believe, and so a compromise was struck. The Adeptus Mechanicum would retain religious and administrative autonomy over Mars and its forge worlds. In return, they would supply the Emperor with war machines, voidcraft, engines, and the tech priests needed to maintain them. Martian red would mix with Imperial gold. Together, they would build a war engine vast enough to reclaim the galaxy. This alliance between science and empire, ritual and reason, became one of the most pivotal cornerstones of the Imperium. It was also one of its greatest contradictions. With the Great Crusade underway, the Mechanicum expanded with it. Tech priests traveled aboard every expeditionary fleet, tending to plasma drives and star fortresses with whispered Binharic prayers and mechanical precision. Forge worlds began to spring up across compliant space, each one echoing the Martian template. Manufactoria, forges, cathedral-sized engines, and a rigid caste system governed by logic and purity of function. The Forge of Lucius, the orbital bastions of Metallica, the deep core reactors of Risa, each one a vital artery in the body of the Imperium. But the price of such power was compromise. The Imperium embraced the standard template construct, STC system, as its sacred inheritance. These ancient pre-strife blueprints were fragments of humanity's lost golden age, capable of producing self-replicating machines, autonomous cities, and even entire civilizations in code. The Mechanicum viewed them as divine relics. Recovering an STC was not just a victory, it was a miracle. Many of the Crusade's most intense battles were fought not for territory, but for STC fragments buried in dead worlds, guarded by Xenos, or hidden in ruins left to rot. The pursuit of such technology became a quest unto itself, and the Mechanicum would kill for it. The tech priests brought wonders, Titan legions, city-sized war machines armed with weapons capable of vaporizing armies. These god engines, operated by the Collegia Titanica, were both revered and feared. When deployed in battle, entire populations fell to their knees at the sight of a single warlord Titan striding across the horizon, its footfalls shaking the sky. They also brought the Legio Cybernetica, cohorts of battle automata guided by logic engines and ancient code. Mindless, relentless, perfect in formation. In the field, they fought alongside astartes, their metallic forms humming with stored kinetic force. Void ships, macro cannons, power armor, plasma weaponry, all of it flowed from Mechanicum forges. Without them, the Crusade would have stalled before it left Sol. But beneath the surface, a schism brewed. Many within the Mechanicum held secrets, forbidden research, xenotech salvaged against Imperial decree, even experimentation with warp-bound energies. These practices were veiled in layers of machine code and sealed vaults. The Emperor knew of some of these deviations. Others remained hidden. The truth was simple. The Emperor tolerated the Mechanicum's beliefs, but he did not share them. Where they saw the machine god, he saw only tools. Where they revered ancient code, he sought to evolve it. The alliance was not built on trust, it was built on need. And that need only grew as the galaxy opened wider. Among the primarchs, relationships with the Mechanicum varied. Ferrus Manus embraced their logic, becoming almost a priest himself in manner and mindset. His iron hands worked closely with Martian tech lords, exchanging methods and philosophies. Some even whispered that Ferrus might one day join the priesthood, had his path not been bound to war. Perturabo too saw value in the Forge worlds, not for their rituals, but for their precision. His Fourth Legion leveraged Martian support to build siege engines, orbital defenses, and labyrinthine kill zones of unspeakable complexity. But others were wary. Mortarion despised them. He viewed their rites as superstition in disguise. To him, the Mechanicum were no better than the sorcerers of old, cloaking ignorance in robes and data scrolls. Even Magnus, for all his arcane wisdom, treaded carefully around their black vaults and sealed archives. There was power there, too much power, and some doors, once opened, could not be shut. Yet for all the tension, the war went on. Mechanicum fleets shadowed every major campaign, their engines fueling the Crusade's relentless momentum. Forge Fanes rose on newly compliant worlds, reshaping entire continents into production hives. Where the Astartes brought victory, the Mechanicum consolidated it. This symbiosis of faith and fire, of Martian steel and Imperial will, created an Imperium like no other. It would also sow the seeds of a future war, one where blood and oil would flow together in ruin. But in this era, the Alliance held, and the Great Crusade marched forward, forged in red flame and bound in steel. The Emperor's dream was unity, a vast and ordered galaxy ruled by mankind alone, free from superstition and chaos. That dream marched forward on armored boots and golden banners, led by warriors bred for war and bound by oath. But unity, when forged in fire and blood, has a way of cracking from within. And in the years following the mass return of the Primarchs, as the Great Crusade reached its height, the cracks began to show. On the surface, the Imperium had never been stronger. 17 Primarchs led their legions across the stars. Thousands of worlds fell in line beneath the Imperial truth. The Mechanicum kept the war engine alive, and the people, the teeming billions, saw hope where once there was only darkness. But for those closest to the fire, the glow began to distort. The Imperium's strength no longer lay in one will, it lay in many, and many wills rarely stay aligned for long. Each Primarch was a force of nature, born of the same father, but shaped by different worlds, cultures, and traumas. They were never designed to be the same. The Emperor, in his infinite genius, had given each of them traits that reflected a fragment of humanity's potential. One was born for logic, another for fury, one for artistry, another for endurance. But where one Primarch saw virtue, another saw flaw. Robout Guillimain of the Ultramarines, precise, bureaucratic, idealistic, could not understand the savage pragmatism of Leman Russ, whose loyalty was unquestionable, but whose methods were often brutal and instinct-driven. Mortarion of the Death Guard bristled under the Imperial truth, still haunted by the tyranny of psychers on his homeworld. His disdain for Magnus the Red, the psychic savant of Prospero, was no secret. They debated openly, bitterly, one citing reason, the other necessity, both convinced they were right. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, trusted none of them. In his nightmares he saw their betrayals long before they began. And Perturabo, ever brooding in the shadows of more favored brothers, resented their glory even as he bled for the same cause. The Emperor's absence didn't help. With the crusade in full swing, he had begun to withdraw, delegating more and more to his sons. Horus, favored and first found, became the de facto voice of the throne on the frontiers. His word carried the Emperor's weight. This elevation did not go unnoticed. To some, Horus was a rallying point, a leader of unmatched charisma and strategic brilliance. To others, he was a symbol of imbalance. Why should one primarch command another? They were brothers, not subordinates. Equals, not pawns. But hierarchy had crept in all the same, and it deepened the rifts. The disagreements were not always hostile, not at first. They emerged in council meetings, in strategic planning, in the approach to compliance. Some primarchs believed in diplomacy, others in domination. Some were content to break a world and leave. Others insisted on rebuilding it in the imperial image. The question at the heart of it all: what kind of Imperium are we building? Sanguinius saw an empire of hope. Angron saw only control masked as freedom. Guilliman saw a civil machine. Kurz saw an inevitable collapse. Magnus saw a species on the edge of enlightenment. Russ saw a pack that had forgotten its teeth. And in the silence between their answers, dissonance grew. Even among the legions, friction bled down the chain of command. Astartes fought together on campaign, but their cultures clashed. The stoicism of the Iron Hands grated against the theatricality of the Emperor's children. The brutal tactics of the Night Lords disturbed the disciplined warriors of the Ultramarines. The Thousand Sons were quietly shunned, their psychic practices eyed with suspicion despite official sanction. Small insults became grudges. Grudges became scars. The camaraderie of the early crusade, when Astartes saw each other as brothers in a righteous cause, had begun to wear thin. Now they looked for loyalty not in one another, but in their gene father alone. A telling moment came on the world of Carpathia during a joint operation between the Word-Bearers and the Dark Angels. The planet had long been ruled by a religious technocracy, its people stubbornly clinging to their pantheon of void spirits and celestial judges. Lorgar, devout even in the face of the imperial truth, sought to convert the population. Not just bring them to heel, but show them the light of the Emperor as a god. Lion El Yonson, stern and unflinching, overruled him. The world was razed, its temples turned to ash, its people erased from existence. Lorgar never forgot the insult or the hypocrisy. He had been punished before, censured for his faith. The Emperor had made it clear worship was forbidden. The imperial truth was the only path. But Lorgar had believed, and now he was beginning to doubt, not the worth of faith, but the Emperor's right to deny it. Elsewhere, Magnus pushed deeper into the warp, trying to master what others feared. He spoke of hidden truths, of psychic potential waiting to be unlocked. Some of his brothers listened, others warned him to stop. The Emperor, for his part, remained distant. He was no longer always present at council. His great project, whatever it was, had taken him from the field. Rumors whispered of a secret endeavor beneath the imperial palace, of a machine or a gate or a god-killing engine. No one knew for sure, but the silence left space for doubt, and doubt festered. Still, the crusade marched on. Worlds continued to fall under the Aquila. The fleets grew larger. The legions swelled. Humanity's dominion over the stars expanded by the hour. But it was a dominion without cohesion, a machine with too many gears turning out of sync. To the common citizen, it looked like progress. To the remembrancers, it looked like destiny. But to those standing at the heart of it, it looked like a fire waiting for wind. Unity had brought the Imperium to the stars, but dissonance would shape what it became. What began as whispers in council halls and glances across war tables would one day ignite into heresy, not because the Emperor's sons were evil, not because they craved rebellion, but because they were too human, too different, too far gone to remember what unity was meant to be. In the cold silence between the stars, it was not just steel and will that carried humanity forward. It was power, unseen, untouchable, unknowable to most, and for some, unforgivable. The warp had always been there, behind the veil of real space, a dimension of raw emotion and chaotic energy, shaping reality with thoughts, dreams, and nightmares. Humanity's psychers, those rare individuals born sensitive to that shifting realm, were once feared, burned, or used by ignorant tyrants. But during the Great Crusade, that fear was transformed into something far more dangerous: acceptance. And it began with a single, controversial vision, the Librarius Project. From the beginning, the Emperor had understood the warp, not merely as a tool, but as a threat. He had walked its paths long before his sons were born, and he knew what slumbered in its depths. His policy had always been cautious. The warp was to be used sparingly, safeguarded, cloaked in discipline. But as the Crusade expanded, as warp storms shifted and the distances between star systems grew, psychers became a necessary evil. Navigators guided ships through the Imperium. Astropaths relayed thoughts across light years. Without them, the Crusade would have collapsed under its own weight. Still, the Emperor drew a line. No astartes, no superhuman soldier of the legions, was to wield psychic power without restraint. The dangers were too great. Until that line began to blur, it started with Magnus the Red. Among the primarchs, none understood the warp as he did. His mastery of psychic arts was not born of accident, but purpose. From a young age on Prospero, Magnus had studied the immaterial with fascination and reverence. To him, the warp was not chaos, it was potential, a realm of knowledge waiting to be understood. He did not fear it, he embraced it, and through him the 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons, became humanity's first and greatest battalion of sanctioned psychers. They did not simply burn their enemies with witchfire or twist reality with force of will. They studied, they disciplined, they turned raw power into art, and as the Crusade raged on, their efficiency on the battlefield became undeniable. Other legions noticed, some were curious, others were deeply concerned. Magnus proposed a bold step forward, a formal, structured initiative across all legions to identify, train, and employ psychic talent. No longer in the shadows, no longer feared. A new institution, controlled, disciplined, loyal, the Librarius. It would be a new corps within the Legion's astartes, a place for battle psychers to serve openly under sanctioned conditions. Not heretics, not outcasts, warriors of mind and spirit, as loyal as any blade. The Emperor approved, cautiously and for reasons of his own. Perhaps he saw the utility. Perhaps he hoped that formalizing psychic use would contain its worst risks. Or perhaps, as some would later suspect, he simply wanted to watch it unfold from a distance. Regardless, the order went out. The project began, and the legions responded. Some embraced it. The Ultramarines, ever eager for structure and innovation, established their Librarius cadres quickly. Under Robut Guilliman's supervision, psychically gifted warriors were brought into the fold with rigor and ceremony. They were tested, examined, bound by oath and logic. To Guilliman, this was simply another evolution, another refinement in the Imperium's war engine. The Blood Angels too saw promise in the Librarius. Sanguinius, though not a psyker himself, understood the gift. His sons bore a psychic flaw deep within their gene seed, a darkness they could not name. The librarians, he believed, might one day help them master it. The Space Wolves, however, refused. Leman Russ would not suffer sorcery in his ranks. To him, the warp was a poisoned well. Drink from it, and rot from within. He claimed his legion already had priests of wisdom and power, the rune priests, warrior shamans of Fenris who wielded their abilities in the old ways. To outsiders, they were indistinguishable from psykers. To Russ, they were something else entirely. The hypocrisy was plain. The wolves denied the Librarius while practicing its equivalent, but no one challenged Russ to his face. Not then. Other legions fell somewhere in between. The Iron Hands adopted librarians as war assets, tools to be wielded, not understood. The White Scars embraced them as storm callers and visionaries. The Dark Angels integrated them with quiet caution, always watching for signs of corruption. But the word-bearers seethed. Lorgar had once been punished for worshipping the Emperor as a god. He had been rebuked, humiliated, and told to cast aside faith in favor of logic. And now those same voices allowed witchcraft in open daylight. He did not forget. He did not forgive. As the Librarius grew, so did the tension around it. On some worlds, psychic powers ensured swift compliance. On others, they inspired rebellion. Rumors spread of astartes melting minds, rewriting memories, conjuring fire from nothing. To many citizens of the Imperium, psykers were still witches, monsters, and no amount of armor or litanies could change that. The remembrancers, artists and poets embedded within the Crusade, struggled with how to portray them. Some painted librarians as noble sorcerer knights, others depicted them as barely restrained nightmares. And among the legions themselves, the divide deepened. The Death Guard refused to integrate librarians. Mortarion, like Russ, had been raised in a world where psykers were tyrants. He trusted steel, not sorcery. His contempt for Magnus became open hatred. In his eyes, the Thousand Sons had become a legion of witches. Then came the Council of Nicaea, a convocation of the primarchs summoned by the Emperor himself to settle the question once and for all. Was the Librarius to be embraced or abolished? Magnus argued for its continuation. Mortarion and Russ demanded its end. Others wavered. The Emperor listened to them all, and when he passed judgment, it was final. The Librarius project was to be halted. All astartes psykers were to be removed from active service. Only navigators and astropaths would retain sanctioned use of warp powers. To Magnus, it was a betrayal. He had poured his soul into the Librarius, believed in it, shaped it, and now the very institution he helped build was declared heresy. He obeyed, outwardly, but within him something broke. The Librarius project, though officially dismantled, left a scar, a memory of what might have been and what still simmered in secret. Some legions continued their psychic practices in defiance. Others hunted their own librarians, purging them as traitors. A quiet civil war had begun beneath the armor and glory, and Magnus, son of the Emperor, would not forget. The warp had given him vision, and in that vision he saw a galaxy burning. The imperial truth declared one fundamental law, spoken in every tongue and etched into the hearts of every citizen across the stars. There shall be no peace with the alien. In the early years of the Great Crusade, that phrase was a rallying cry. Later, it became a doctrine. By the time the Imperium reached the galactic core, it was an absolute. No diplomacy, no coexistence, no exceptions. To build an empire of man, all others had to be unmade. Humanity had not risen in isolation. While Terra had burned in techno-barbarism and warp storms had severed all communication between stars, the void had not remained empty. Across 1,000,000 worlds, Xenos empires had grown fat in the absence of mankind. Ancient powers, newly born dynasties, or ravenous beasts. The Crusade reached them all, and brought extermination in its wake. The orcs were among the first and most relentless enemies encountered, not because they were strategic or cunning, but because they were everywhere. They seeded themselves like a plague, feral spores taking root in backwater worlds, junk-built vessels crashing into planets and vomiting out mobs of war-obsessed brutes. No two encounters were the same. One warband might ride scrap-hewn walkers and scream in guttural chants, while another hurled crude asteroids through void space just to watch them burn. But all shared one trait. They lived to fight. To the Imperium, they were an infestation, and extermination was the only cure. Ongron and his World Eaters relished these battles, diving into the heart of green tides with chain axes spinning. The Iron Warriors devised mathematical kill boxes, treating the greenskins like a problem of logistics. The Raven Guard, striking from shadow, hunted war bosses through jungle and hive alike. Thousands of orc empires were shattered, and yet the orcs never truly died. They endured, not as nations, but as a constant war. Then there were the Eldar. Their empire had once stretched across the stars, a civilization of infinite decadence and terrible beauty. But by the time the Crusade reached their borders, that golden age was gone. In its place stood ghost ships, ruined craft worlds, and a dying people clinging to memory. The Eldar fought not for conquest, but for survival. And still the Imperium showed no mercy. On Morelia, the Blood Angels obliterated an Eldar enclave believed to be shielding an ancient psychic weapon. It did not matter that the weapon no longer functioned. Its very presence was enough to warrant annihilation. On Eidolon, the White Scars pursued a retreating Eldar fleet through webway portals, emerging on distant moons and shattering them with precise orbital strikes. Entire populations were vaporized in seconds. To the Emperor's sons, pity had no place. The Eldar were psychers, deceivers, and manipulators, ancient beyond comprehension, yet decadent and cursed. They had squandered their empire. Now they would not be allowed to rebuild it. The Hrud, time-shrouded creatures lurking in the cracks of reality, fared no better. Their migrations decayed everything in their wake. Where they settled, entropy followed. Machines rusted, cities aged centuries overnight, and flesh withered. The Imperium's policy was clear: immediate sterilization. The Dark Angels led multiple campaigns into the Hrud-infested underrealms of Cassarion and Polomia, deploying exterminatus-class weapons without hesitation. Time itself fractured in those battles. Veterans returned, changed, aged, hollow-eyed, some unable to speak. And yet the war continued. The Imperium could not afford hesitation. The cost of mercy was extinction. Other species were less infamous, but no less doomed. The rock ghoul cybernetic monstrosities were purged in brutal naval engagements. The megarachnids of murder, insectoid horrors, were annihilated by the lunar wolves in a campaign that cost thousands of lives and marked the first time Horus questioned the cost of the Crusade. The Lair, the Jorgal, the Kynabrak, all destroyed. In each case, a pattern emerged. The Imperium arrived, the Xenos resisted, and then they vanished, buried beneath orbital fire, blade, and doctrine. But the destruction was never random. It was deliberate, systematic. The Ordo Xenos, though not yet fully formed, operated in the background, cataloging alien species, assessing their threat levels, identifying potential technologies. The Mechanicum scoured battlefields for salvage. Some Xenos tech was kept, studied, even quietly copied. Most was incinerated. To adopt too much was to become impure. To understand too deeply was to risk contamination. And still, the extermination continued. Not all primarchs agreed on the methods. Sanguinius believed in swift, clean war. End the threat. Spare the innocent. But even he could not argue when faced with Xenos cities pulsing with warp energies, or crystalline hives singing to unknown gods. Guilliman sought logic in every extermination. If a species could be reasoned with, contained, or used, it was worth consideration. But few survived his standards. Fewer still survived his guns. Conrad Kurz needed no reason. For him, Xenos were simply one more infection to purge. The fear they inspired in humans was proof of their wickedness. And Lorgar secretly began to wonder if perhaps there was wisdom to be found in the ashes. After all, why did the Eldar fear the warp so deeply? What had they seen, he asked, but no one answered. The most haunting campaigns came not against the monstrous, but the familiar. Some Xenos looked like men, spoke like men, claimed common ancestry. The Interrex encountered by the Luna Wolves were a post-human culture that had flourished during the Age of Strife, technologically advanced, philosophically complex, even tolerant of peaceful Xenos. Horus saw potential in them. Diplomacy was attempted. It failed. A single misunderstanding, an artifact stolen, a display misread, and the Interrex fired first. That was all it took. The Imperium responded with fire. The Interrex vanished in weeks. Even Horus, victorious, said nothing of it afterward. He simply watched the stars in silence. The phrase Xenos annihilated became a footnote on campaign logs, a seal of approval, a mark of thoroughness. Few stopped to ask what was lost, what languages, art, history, or dreams were turned to ash. That wasn't the point. This was not a war of conquest. It was a war of purity, and it left no room for rivals. In the end, the Great Crusade was not remembered for what it created. It was remembered for what it erased. Entire civilizations, once mighty, are now names on forbidden scrolls. Their last survivors were dissected in labs or silenced in battle. Their gods, if they had them, were forgotten. Their legacies buried beneath imperial cities, paved over by triumph and amnesia. To the Imperium, this was progress. To the stars, it was a genocide unlike any seen before. But it was not yet called that. Not yet. The banners snapped in the wind of 1,000 void engines. The skies were filled with thunder, not of storms, but of cheering voices and cannon salute. On the blasted, blood-soaked plains of Ulanor, a new legend was forged, not in the fire of battle, but in the stillness that followed. The triumph at Ulanor marked the apex of the Great Crusade, a single campaign, a single victory, yet it would echo through history like the footsteps of a titan. It was the Imperium's greatest moment, and also its turning point. For decades, the Great Crusade had pushed further and further into the galaxy's western edge, driving back the Xenos threat, breaking system-spanning empires and forging unity in blood. But one enemy stood defiant amid the star clusters of the Ulanor region, an Orc empire of unprecedented size and organization, led by a warlord whose name echoed like thunder. Urlak Urg, more than a beast, more than a tyrant. Urg was a tactical genius, for an Orc, a contradiction. His empire stretched across a dozen sectors, each world fortified with asteroid belts, gun moons, and massive orbital structures. He had united disparate Orc clans into a single Wah that had swallowed entire Crusade fleets in earlier attempts to breach it. But now the full force of the Imperium descended upon him. Not a skirmish, not a recon operation, a war of annihilation. The Ulanor Crusade was led by Horus, the favored son, the first primarch, war master in all but title. At his side stood Leman Russ, Ferrus Manus, Fulgrim, and Rogal Dorn, each commanding their legions with cold efficiency and brutal grace. Fleet after fleet translated into the system, slamming into orc-held space like hammers against stone. Entire moons were weaponized, planets were turned into battlefields, void war erupted across dozens of systems simultaneously. Horus did not just command. He orchestrated, directing entire fleets like a conductor before an orchestra of annihilation. His strategy was relentless, always 2 moves ahead of the orcs. The Lunar Wolves, his own 16th Legion, struck deep into the heart of the Empire, decapitating supply lines, assassinating key war bosses, and sowing chaos behind the Greenskin front. Ferrus Manus' Iron Hands destroyed orc fortresses by weaponizing tectonic shifts, cracking entire continents. Rogal Dorn led massed siege formations that slowly, methodically ground enemy bastions into dust. Fulgrim unleashed the Emperor's children in flanking maneuvers so precise they became legend. Russ cut through orc strongholds like a thunderstorm incarnate, leaving no survivors. And at the heart of it all, Horus stood tall, the eye of the storm, the favored son of a golden empire. The final battle took place on Ulanor Prime, the throne world of Urlak-Urg himself. The Orc warlord had built a mega-fortress that sprawled across continents, a hive city of rust, bone, and blackened iron. Its walls were kilometers thick, its towers pierced the stratosphere, its weaponry had downed Imperial ships with single volleys. But Horus led the charge. The assault lasted for 13 brutal days. Orc counterattacks came like tidal waves, breaking against walls of ceramite and bolter fire. Lunar wolves fought room to room, clawing their way through endless tunnels. The skies burned with the exhaust of drop pods and plasma detonations. On the 13th day, Horus personally led the final spearhead. He descended with his Justarin Terminators into the heart of the fortress. The battle that followed is recorded only in fragments, blood-soaked Vox logs, broken Pict feeds, and the personal accounts of warriors who never forgot what they saw. Urlak-Urg died by Horus's hand. It is said that the warlord was thrice the size of a man, armored in scrap and hatred. But Horus brought him down in single combat, surrounded by fire and ruin. When the Orc warlord fell, the Wa fell with him. Ulanor was won, and something changed forever. The triumph was not a simple parade, it was a declaration. The Imperium celebrated not just the end of a campaign, but the symbolic pinnacle of the Great Crusade. Thousands of banners were raised, billions of citizens witnessed the victory in projected broadcasts across the segmentum solar. 100 legions stood in salute. The Emperor himself arrived on Ulanor. For the first time in years, he walked among his sons. He spoke few words, but what he said reshaped the future. There, on the grand concourse of Ulanor Prime, beneath the twin suns and the thunder of a billion cheers, the Emperor proclaimed, "From this day forward, Horus Lupercal shall bear the title of War Master. He shall command the hosts of the Imperium in my name." It was a moment of glory and a moment of separation. The Emperor, having guided the crusade from the front for decades, now stepped back. He would return to Terra, to his great work, a project so secret, not even the primarchs understood it. Rumors swirled, a machine beneath the palace, a new form of travel, a weapon against the warp. But no answers came. Only the War Master remained. Among the legions, the proclamation sent ripples. Some rejoiced. Horus was beloved, his charisma legendary, his record unchallenged. But others whispered in quiet corners. Why him? Why now? And what was so important that the Emperor would abandon his sons at the height of their triumph? Loyalty held, but cracks were forming. As the triumph concluded, a city-sized triumphal arch was erected on Ulanor, a monument to imperial might and to Horus's new title. Beneath it, astartes and mortal soldiers marched for hours. Choirs sang. War machines were displayed like trophies. But not all primarchs remained to bask in the celebration. Mortarion returned to his fleet early, unsmiling. Kurz vanished before the closing speeches. Even Perturabo, who had not been present for the final battle, sent only a cold message of congratulations. The seeds were there, silent, unnoticed. In the moment, the triumph at Ulanor was a victory without flaw. A galaxy bowed, a warlord fell, and a sun was elevated to command the stars. But in hindsight, historians would mark that day not as the zenith of the Imperium, but the start of its descent. Horus had been given the throne of war, and the Emperor had turned his back. They called him the Night Haunter, not as a title, not as a mark of honor, but as a warning whispered in the dark places of the Imperium, where fear carried more weight than banners. Konrad Curze, Primarch of the Night Lords, was not born into glory. He was born into horror, and that horror never left him. The planet was Nostromo, a polluted husk of a world cloaked in perpetual darkness from its thick industrial smog. Its cities were vast, decaying labyrinths lit only by the neon glow of broken signs and the flickering fires of gang wars. Law had collapsed long ago. Corruption was not a flaw of the system. It was the system. The people were broken, beaten, savage. And into this world the Primarch fell, a child cast from the warp, alone, unclaimed, unnamed. He grew up in the gutters, hunted by predators, and became the thing they feared. He spoke little, he killed swiftly, and he never forgot a face. The legends say he appeared as a wraith, draped in shadows, eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. He slaughtered criminals with surgical precision, not in anger, but in calculation. He tore apart crime syndicates, executed corrupt officials, strung murderers from lampposts. He reshaped the city not with speeches or edicts, but with terror. And it worked. Crime plummeted. The gangs fled. Justice, such as it was, returned. But it was not justice born of compassion. It was vengeance. The people began to whisper a name for the ghost in the alleys, Night Haunter. It became both a legend and a truth, a being who punished evil so mercilessly that the fear of his arrival did more than any army ever could. When the Emperor finally came to Nostromo, Curzi greeted him not with joy, but resignation. He had seen the Emperor in visions long before his arrival. He had foreseen his own role in the crusade, and what would follow. He knelt quietly and joined the Imperium. The 8th Legion, which would become the Night Lords, reflected their Gene Father's ideals. They were not builders, not visionaries. They were executioners. Where the Night Lords went, the Imperium followed, not out of inspiration, but out of fear. Their methods were direct, brutal, and effective. Cities would surrender before a single shot was fired, simply because a flayed corpse was found hanging over their gates, marked with the sigil of the 8th Legion. Compliance by terror, obedience through dread. Other legions raised worlds. The Night Lords made them regret rebellion before the first drop pod ever fell. But their methods earned them few friends. Gilliman condemned them as unstable. Dorn demanded formal sanctions. Even Sanguinius, ever a symbol of hope, could not hide his revulsion. Yet Horus, ever the diplomat, tolerated them. As War Master, he needed results, and the Night Lords delivered. Konrad Kurz remained distant from his brothers. He spoke rarely in war councils, often communicating through envoys or cold, precise Vox transmissions. He did not celebrate victories, he did not boast, and he did not change. But beneath the calculated terror, something deeper festered in him. Visions. From the moment of his creation, Kurz had been plagued by prophetic nightmares, images of the future that seared themselves into his mind. He saw his own fate in shattered glimpses, betrayal, fire, chains, and death. He saw the fall of his brothers, the burning of the Imperium. He saw the heresy before anyone else did, and it broke him. He began to withdraw, speaking more to shadows than to men. His punishments grew crueler, not because he enjoyed pain, but because fear was the only language he believed the galaxy understood. He did not want to become a monster, but he knew that he was one. Back on Nostromo, the people watched the skies with awe. Their savior had ascended to the stars, become a demigod. The criminal underground that had once cowered now re-emerged, cloaking their operations in the image of their lost son. And when word reached Kurz that Nostromo had returned to its old ways, that the people had betrayed his sacrifice, he made a choice. He turned his fleet around and ordered the extermination of his own homeworld. Nostromo was shattered by orbital bombardment, its crust cracked, its cities vaporized. Millions died screaming under falling skies, not as a message to the Imperium, but as a message to himself. Fear is the only truth. The Night Lords changed after that. Once warriors of terrifying discipline, they became something darker, less structured, more sadistic. Their tactics remained effective, but their souls had corroded. The line between justice and cruelty dissolved. They wore death as armor, painted their armor in flayed skin, turned battle into theater, not for glory, for effect. They wanted their enemies to break before the battle began. Kurz himself became more reclusive. He began to wear shadows like a cloak, disappearing from council entirely for months at a time. Some claimed he no longer slept, fearing the visions that waited for him in dreams. Others whispered he no longer needed sleep, that the warp itself whispered constantly in his ears. He did not seek the company of his brothers, and they, in turn, kept their distance. Only Fulgrim seemed to understand him, or pretended to. Only Horus treated him as an equal, though even that Kurz saw as manipulation. He believed his fate was already written, and he hated the Emperor for making it so. On campaign, the 8th Legion continued to earn victory after victory, but their successes came with a growing unease. Human colonists greeted ultramarines with songs. They met the Night Lords with silence, and sometimes sobbing. Compliance was compliance, but the cost weighed heavier each time. Remembrancers, those tasked with documenting the glory of the Crusade, often refused to accompany Night Lords' campaigns. Some who did returned broken, or not at all. The 8th Legion began to disappear from official records, their victories noted only as strategic footnotes, devoid of detail. The Imperium had found its hammer, but it feared to look at the hand that held it. Konrad Kurzi was not mad. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and decided that only Terra could hold the species together. To him, the imperial truth was a fantasy, the lectitio divinitatus, a heresy, the dream of a united mankind, a lie. He would not say it aloud, but he would prove it. As the crusade marched on and as the War Master's shadow began to stretch across the stars, Kurz did not scheme. He simply waited, because he had already seen how it would end, and the galaxy had no idea what was coming. They were both weapons, sharpened beyond all natural limits, shaped by violence, purpose, and design. Each was forged to lead, to command, to break empires and inspire legions. But Lehman Russ and Lionel Johnson were more than warriors. They were opposites. And opposites, when forced together, do not always balance. Sometimes they collide. The tale of Russ and the Lion was not one of betrayal or hatred. Not at first. It was something subtler, deeper, a wound between brothers that never fully healed. Their story began not on the battlefield, but in the space between wars, where pride, secrecy, and ancient grievance simmered like magma beneath the armor. Leman Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, was fire and instinct, a warrior in the truest sense, brutal and honest, feral yet fiercely loyal. He believed in strength through struggle, in brotherhood forged through blood and challenge. His space wolves, the Vulca Fenrica, were like him, aggressive, untamed, proud of their savage customs. To outsiders they seemed wild, but to Russ their ways were sacred, rooted in ancient honor, purposeful. The lion, in contrast, was cold precision. Raised in the darkness of Caliban, Lionel Johnson was a master of war before he ever knew the Imperium existed. He saw the galaxy through a lens of structure, hierarchy, and secrets. Everything was a game of strategy, and every action part of a larger design. The Dark Angels, his first legion, mirrored his mind. They were silent, disciplined, and utterly lethal. They struck like a sword in the dark, fast, efficient, and unseen. Where Russ demanded action and loud truth, the lion lived in planning and silence. And so the stage was set. Their rivalry would come to a head on the world of Dulan, a campaign like many others. A rebellious human warlord, the self-proclaimed tyrant of Dulan, had declared his system independent of the Imperium. He had fortified his world with a powerful orbital defense network and a ground army numbering in the millions. Both the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves were deployed to bring the system to heel. And that's where everything went wrong. The plan was simple. The Dark Angels would disable the orbital defenses, allowing the Wolves to lead the assault on the planet itself. Coordination was essential, timing critical. But the lion, in his usual fashion, withheld key information. He altered the plan, striking earlier than agreed, using his own tactics without informing Russ. He succeeded. The orbital platforms fell. But in doing so, he robbed Russ of the opportunity to lead the assault. The glory of the campaign, the final strike against the tyrant's citadel, was claimed by the Dark Angels. Russ was furious. Not because he had lost credit, but because in his eyes the lion had acted with dishonor. Honor, to Russ, meant brotherhood. Trust, facing your enemies head-on, never hiding your intent. The lion's secrecy was a betrayal of that code. To the lion, however, it was simply good strategy. The objective had been achieved. The tyrant was dead. The system brought into compliance. What did pride matter when the war was won? But pride did matter, especially to sons created for war. In the aftermath of Dulan, words turned to blows. Russ, unable to contain his rage, struck the lion across the jaw. The lion responded in kind, not with an insult, but with a fist. What followed was not a duel, but a brawl. Two demigods, primarchs of the Imperium, locked in furious combat not over territory or ideology or heresy, but over wounded egos and conflicting philosophies. No one intervened. Their legions watched in silence, stunned. In the end, Russ laughed. He laughed in the lion's face, bloodied but triumphant, thinking the fight over. The lion did not laugh. He waited, then struck Russ from behind, knocking him unconscious, and walked away. That moment became legend. Among the wolves, it was a tale of the lion's cowardice, how he could not accept defeat. Among the Dark Angels, it was proof of Russ's brutishness, how his pride clouded his judgment. Neither side forgot. The enmity between their legions became quiet, but permanent. Over time, the Imperium moved on. New wars erupted, new alliances were forged, but the wounds between the wolf and the lion festered beneath the surface. They fought together on other campaigns, but never with warmth, always with caution, with distrust. Russ came to see the lion as a brother in blood, but not in spirit, and the lion ever silent, never offered reconciliation. And yet the irony of their rivalry was this: they were more alike than either would ever admit. Both carried burdens deeper than any legionary could fathom. Both held loyalty to the Emperor above all else. Both knew secrets, rusts of the Emperor's justice, the lion of ancient sins buried beneath Caliban. And both would one day be tested in ways no warrior should be. During the final years of the Crusade, there were whispers of the lion's growing distance. He began operating more independently, leading his legion into the eastern fringe, chasing threats unknown, offering few reports. Some said he was hunting a great Xenos menace. Others claimed he was following a secret order from the Emperor. Russ suspected he was hiding something, but the Great Crusade left little time for speculation. Worlds burned, the stars turned red with war, and the primarchs pressed forward, unaware of what fate had already begun to weave. There was no final resolution to the story of the wolf and the lion, no moment of closure, no forgiveness. Just two warriors, forged for the same purpose, standing on different sides of an unspoken line. In another life, perhaps, they would have been allies, friends even. But in the galaxy the Emperor gave them, trust was rare, and pride was deadly. Their clash was just one more tremor beneath the surface, one more fracture in a brotherhood that would soon be shattered. By the latter years of the Great Crusade, the galaxy was ablaze with banners bearing the Aquila. System after system had fallen beneath the tread of imperial war machines. Legions that had once bled to take a single world now conquered entire sectors in months. Victory seemed inevitable, but beneath the golden armor of progress, something else was growing, something brittle, hollow, and dangerous. The Imperium was winning, but it was not united. Compliance. The word had once meant hope, order, integration into a greater destiny. At the dawn of the Crusade, compliance was a process, diplomacy where possible, reconstruction where needed, force only when required. The Emperor himself had encouraged restraint. The idea was to bring humanity back into the fold, not by fear but by vision. But vision was a luxury, and by the time the Crusade reached its final decades, the vision had been exhausted. Now, compliance meant one thing: submission. It wasn't a shift declared by decree. There was no policy change, just a slow, brutal redefinition. At first, the fault lines were cultural. Many rediscovered human civilizations resisted the imperial truth, not because they loved tyranny or chaos, but because they believed in something different. Gods, spirits, traditions passed down for millennia. To the Emperor and to most of his sons, these were relics of ignorance, and ignorance could not be tolerated. What began as quiet persuasion soon became censorship. Then book burnings, then public executions. The legions adapted. Where once remembrancers recorded ceremonies of unification, now they documented mass purges. Where planetary governors once negotiated their place in the Imperium, now they were given two choices: bow or burn. The line between pacification and extermination blurred with every new campaign. Some primarchs leaned into this new reality with ease. Mortarion of the Death Guard saw it as purification. He believed humanity was a body diseased by ignorance, and his legion were the cure. Angron and the World Eaters saw compliance as conquest, no more, no less. Perturabo, ever the logician, stopped asking questions. If the ledger said a world had failed to comply, it was raised. Simple arithmetic. Others struggled. Guilliman, despite his strategic mind, began to question the ideological purity of their mission. His own empire in the making, Ultramar, had thrived on structure and order, not terror. Sanguinius wept for worlds where the only choice was submission or death. But even their doubts were quiet. The machine kept moving. Cracks deepened between the legions as well. Campaign coordination broke down. Some primarchs refused to fight alongside others. Old rivalries, once playful, now edged with real contempt. On Genna, the word-bearers and the imperial fists both landed to enforce compliance. When the word-bearers began proselytizing to the population, offering cryptic sermons about unity through faith, rogal dorn demanded they cease. Lorgar refused. The fists withdrew. The city was later destroyed. No formal punishment came, but tensions rose. The Librarius Edict from the Council of Nicaea had further fragmented cohesion. Some legions obeyed, disbanding their psychic cadres. Others, like the Thousand Sons, continued in secret. Whispers of inconsistency ran through the ranks. If rules were not enforced, were they truly law? And if law was optional, was loyalty? The final campaigns of the Crusade were longer, darker, and less certain. Compliance was measured in skulls, victory in silence. Entire worlds were marked compliant when only ashes remained. On Carandal, a feudal human society based on ancient honor codes welcomed imperial envoys, but their refusal to renounce their warrior faith and their psychic seers sealed their fate. Jagatai Khan led the White Scars into battle. It was swift, brutal, efficient. The planet's sun was seeded with cyclonic torpedoes. 3 days later, Carandol became a black cinder in orbit. No monument was made, no entry in the annals of triumph, just another compliant world. By this time, the Emperor had long since returned to Terra. His presence, once a unifying force, was now an absence. The War Master, Horus, led in his name. And Horus led well. But he was not the Emperor. Each Primarch interpreted their mission differently. Each weighed duty against ego in their own measure. Some, like Corvus Corax, began to ask whether the Imperium had strayed from its purpose. Others, like Kurz, believed it had simply revealed its true face. Kurz no longer cared for compliance. He enforced justice, his justice, and watched the stars burn. Even the soldiers began to change. Astartes, once proud of their role in unifying humanity, became jaded. Some no longer knew why they fought. Some no longer cared. Whole generations of mortal soldiers were born and died in the shadow of the legions, never seeing Terra, never knowing peace. Remembrancers stopped sketching scenes of triumph. Instead, they captured emptiness, ruined cities, ghost worlds, eyes without hope. At the outer edges of imperial space, entire sectors were declared compliant without full survey. Administratum officials, eager to close endless campaigns, rubber-stamped reports of victory. But in truth, countless worlds remained only partially under control. Resistance simmered. Faith in the imperial truth wavered. And then there were the signs no one wanted to admit. Warp storms began to thicken again. Astropaths collapsed mid-chant. Whole fleets vanished in translation. On some compliant worlds, cults of strange iconography rose in the night. Secret symbols, whispered prayers to something other than the Emperor. The Mechanicum sent messages from Mars that went unanswered. Even Horus, beloved War Master, began to withdraw into his flagship for longer and longer periods. He had led them to glory, but the strain was visible. He aged, not in body but in presence. He began to doubt. By now, the Great Crusade had become too massive to manage, too widespread to control. What began as a campaign of hope had become an empire of inertia, a galactic war machine grinding forward not by faith, but by momentum. And in that momentum, things were lost. Ideals, unity, truth. The legions did not speak of collapse, but they felt it, in their bones. And so the final days of the Crusade were marked not by celebration, but by silence. Compliance was still declared, maps were still updated, laurels still awarded. But behind the banners, the astartes wondered, what were they building, and at what cost? At the height of the Great Crusade, when the stars themselves bowed before the advance of mankind, the Emperor disappeared, not in body, not entirely, but in presence. The being who had once walked beside his sons, who had led the first assaults against the warp-twisted terrors of the long night, who had looked into the eyes of planetary rulers and offered unity instead of conquest, that Emperor was gone. What remained was silence, a void at the heart of the Imperium. And it changed everything. In the years following the triumph at Ulanor, the Emperor returned to Terra. He made no grand announcement, no ceremony, no farewell. He simply departed, leaving the fate of the galaxy in the hands of Horus Lupercal, now War Master, the highest military authority in the Imperium. At first, it seemed a natural transition. The Crusade was vast, and Horus was his most trusted son. If any primarch could command the loyalty of the others, if any could bring order to a scattered empire of 1,000,000 worlds, it was Horus. The Emperor's choice was seen by many as confirmation that the Lunar Wolf was more than just a favored son. He was the heir in all but name. But not all saw it that way. Some primarchs felt slighted. Robout Guilliman, who had built a thriving empire within the Imperium, questioned why he had not even been consulted. Perturabo, architect of sieges and the master of destruction, felt his contributions had been overlooked. Angron, not that he would ever admit it, grew more violent, his rage barely contained. Lorgar, already questioning the imperial truth, felt abandoned. And Magnus the Red, whose psychic insight gave him glimpses of higher truths, saw only shadows and deceit. The Emperor, once a godlike constant, was now a ghost. On Terra, he entered his palace, a sprawling complex already being fortified beyond comprehension. Beneath its surface, work began on a project known only to a select few, the Webway Project. A massive undertaking that sought to build a human entrance into the Eldar Webway, a labyrinthine network of tunnels through the warp that could allow faster-than-light travel without the risk of demonic corruption. It was genius, it was necessary, and it was secret. Not even the primarchs were told the full truth. The Emperor did not explain his absence. He offered no insight into the goals of his great work. His silence was interpreted in 1,000 different ways, as trust, as betrayal, as indifference. To his sons, who had been bred to serve him, to know him, to seek his approval in all things, this silence was devastating. For many of them, he was more than a commander. He was the reason they fought, and now he was gone. Horus, burdened with command, did his best to uphold the vision. He led with charisma, strength, and a deep desire to preserve the unity his father had built. But he was not the Emperor. He had doubts. He second-guessed decisions. He began to resent the silence from Terra, the lack of recognition, the lack of explanation. What was he fighting for now? What future was he being asked to shape? The lack of clear leadership from the Emperor had consequences. Some primarchs began to act more independently, interpreting the imperial truth as they saw fit. Others began to challenge Horus's authority, not openly, but in defiance masked as autonomy. When Lionel Johnson launched a private campaign into the Eastern Fringe, he sent no reports. When Mortarion purged an entire sector suspected of minor warp corruption, he did so without sanction. Even Fulgrim, once the embodiment of discipline and beauty, began to change. More decadent, more distant, his eyes turning toward strange philosophies. The Emperor's silence became a canvas upon which each son projected his own fears, his own ambitions. Worse still were the rumors. Among the astartes, whispered in the quiet corridors of void ships and whispered over battlefield fires, there were stories. Stories of hidden technologies beneath Terra, of ancient machines powered by the warp, of sacrifices made in the dark. Some claimed the Emperor had found a way to control the warp. Others believed he had created a new form of life. A few dared to say that he had never truly cared for the primarchs at all, that they had been tools, and now that they were no longer needed, he had discarded them. Heresy? Perhaps. But heresy begins not in defiance but in doubt, and doubt had begun to take root. Magnus the Red, ever the seeker of hidden truths, could not bear the silence. He began probing the veil, searching the warp for answers. He saw things he was not meant to see. He saw the Webway project. He saw what would happen if it failed. And he saw Horus falling. But no one would listen. Not yet. On Terra, the Emperor pushed forward with his work. He rarely emerged from the dungeons beneath the palace. The custodes, once guardians of his person, became prison keepers of his mystery. They said he still ruled, but he no longer spoke. The rift between father and sons widened. Some, like Sanguinius, held fast to faith. Others, like Kurz, fell into madness. And Horus, brave, proud, burdened Horus, began to listen to other voices. The silence of the Emperor created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, the gods of the warp began to whisper. The Emperor believed that secrecy was protection, that shielding his sons from the truth would keep them pure, that distance would harden them. But they were not machines. They were his children, and they had been left in the cold. As the Great Crusade reached its final days, the legions pressed onward, but without joy. Victory tasted like ash. Worlds fell but no longer sang. The Emperor had withdrawn, and in his absence the light dimmed. There was no single moment, no trumpet blast, no shattering revelation. The seeds of heresy were not sown with screams, but with silence, with whispers, with glances, with wounds unspoken and loyalties stretched taut. As the Great Crusade neared its end, the Imperium of man was at its peak. It controlled more of the galaxy than any empire before it. Its armies were unrivaled, its legions were godlike. And yet, beneath the banners, the foundation was cracking. The first great betrayal was not a matter of action. It was a matter of belief. It began in the hearts of men. Among the remembrancers, the artists, poets, and historians who traveled with the legions, rumors flowed like ink. Whispers of distant campaigns gone awry, primarchs acting without coordination, worlds declared compliant that still resisted in secret. Even in the legions astartes, doubt crept in. Astartes, who had once followed the Emperor with unshakable purpose, now asked, "Why does he no longer walk among us? What does he hide on Terra? What is it we are building, if not peace?" And then there was Horus, the War Master, once beloved by all, now isolated by his burden. He led fleets across thousands of worlds, his voice carrying the weight of the Imperium. But he no longer heard the voice that mattered most, the voice of the Emperor. At first, he bore it with pride. He told himself this was trust, that his father had given him responsibility as a sign of confidence. But pride, when left alone too long, turns sour. It turns to resentment, and resentment breeds doubt. The timing was no accident. In the warp, the Chaos Gods, ancient malevolent intelligences that fed on emotion and belief, had watched mankind's rise with growing interest. They saw the Emperor's ambition to cut humanity off from the warp, to build a psychic firewall through the Webway. They saw his efforts to deny them worship, to strangle belief at its root. And they knew they must strike. But they did not strike with legions or blades. They used something far more insidious. They used trust. The first step was the whispers in the warp. Slight at first, harmless seeming. A second voice during long warp translations, dreams that lingered too long. Subtle suggestions. They came to mortals and astartes alike, but most of all, they came to those who felt abandoned, to those who still yearned for their father's approval. To Horus, the campaign that changed everything was the Davin incident, a seemingly minor compliance action, a rebellion on a world long since brought into the imperial fold. Horus deployed with confidence, eager to quash it quickly. But Davin held secrets, an ancient temple, a strange artifact, and a trap. There, Horus was mortally wounded by a cursed blade. His body, indomitable as it was, began to fail. The Medici despaired. The word-bearers, particularly the dark priest Erebus, offered a solution, a ritual, not sanctioned by Terra, not rooted in imperial truth, but something older. In desperation, Horus's closest lieutenants agreed. The War Master's spirit was cast into a dreamscape, a warp-born illusion crafted by the Chaos Gods themselves. There he saw a future, a lie, cloaked in fragments of truth. He saw the Emperor building a new race of servants to replace the primarchs. He saw himself cast aside, used, then discarded. He saw his brothers rising against him. He saw the Imperium becoming a religion, with the Emperor enthroned as a god. The very thing he had always denied. He believed it. He woke changed, not with rage, with clarity. This was not possession. This was conviction. He now believed the Emperor had betrayed his sons, his empire, his dream. That the vision of a united humanity had been a mask for a far colder ambition, that the time had come for correction. But Horus was not a madman. He was a general, and he understood that revolutions must begin in quiet. Back among the legions, the fractures deepened. Some were already primed for rebellion. Ongron, whose hatred for the Emperor's refusal to save his gladiator brothers, had never cooled. Mortarion, who despised the Psychers and saw hypocrisy in the Emperor's secret warp project. Perturabo, who grew sick of building empires only to see others praised. Kurz, who had foreseen it all and saw no point in resisting. And Lorgar, who had never truly believed in the imperial truth, only in the idea of worship. They became Horus's foundation. The lodges, unofficial warrior brotherhoods that had taken root within many legions, became a network, a system of loyalty that no longer pointed upward to Terra, but sideways toward each other. The seeds of heresy were now sown across the legions, but still outwardly all seemed stable. Victories were still recorded, new worlds still declared compliance. Only the tone had changed. Glory no longer lit the stars, only grim purpose. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of every triumphant speech and every burned city, there was a pulse, a slow beat, building to a storm. The Great Crusade had not ended. It had become something else, a countdown. Soon there would be no more questions about the Emperor's silence, no more whispers in the dark, only war.